The opinions expressed herein are those of the individual and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Army, the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government, end quote. Did I get it?
Thank you very much. Yep, you got it.
Right.
I don't think we're going to be tackling anything too controversial today, but you never know with Napoleon.
Never know. Yeah, we're covering all our bases here. Again, if you want to walk through as Michael and I are talking, there's a PowerPoint. We're going to talk about basically Napoleon 101, where his tactics came from, his innovations, and we're going to show a lot of examples as we're talking. And for those of you listening in your car, I'm going to try, as is Michael, to describe it on an audio level, just listening without seeing the pictures. But again, this is more of a visual podcast, so bear with us. Okay. Let's dive in, Michael. We're talking Napoleon 101. This is kind of what you talk to your students, right? This is kind of your intro to Napoleon.
Yeah, it's kind of intro to Napoleon. I pulled a lot of things together, but a lot of times when you're talking Napoleon, or historians do, or they're reading, it's talking central position, interior lines, French military theorists. I kind of pulled it all together for us today, and hopefully we can get a good understanding of it all.
All right, sounds good. Let's dive in.
Yep.
So people always talk about, historians, authors, what have you, talk about Napoleon as an innovator. But was he evolutionary or revolutionary as a tactician? Because many of his quote-unquote advancements were written about previous to his taking command, right?
So I'll go ahead and tackle the second part of your question first, about all the theorists kind of leading up to it. And it all goes back to the 7 Years' War. To put it briefly, France gets its butt kicked, and this leads to a lot of introspection within France and the French military institution as a whole. And there were theorists that wrote before the war that gained some new attention, and many wrote after the war. So we're going to go back in time even further to Foulard. And Foulard, officer, tactician, theorist, and he witnesses the kind of complete evolution of firearms technology from the matchlock to the flintlock bayonet to the flintlock musket and socket bayonet. And he himself experienced substantial fighting during the War of Spanish Succession, and his main contribution to all of this discussions is the treatise on columns in the deep order. And this is his reaction to the dominance of linear formations and firepower. Because as firearms became better, we went away from the tercio, so kind of pike and shot, to thinner and thinner lines, maximum firepower to the front. And so what Foulard advocates for is a return to shock tactics and the shock of cold steel. He promoted the deep order, so giant columns, over these thinner linear formations. He wanted huge blocks of 30 soldiers wide, 100 soldiers deep, and he's inspired a lot by ancient warfare, particularly the Greek phalanx and the Spanish tercio. And he thought these columns would be used to shock through enemy lines and just break through and absolutely dominate the enemy. And there are some advantages to columns. There's better maneuverability compared to thin linear formations, and the weight of numbers could overwhelm enemy lines. It's also a little bit better against cavalry just because you're compact and able to defend yourself better. The problem is there are some major disadvantages. These large formations, they make excellent targets, and only the first couple of ranks could fire effectively. And so ultimately, all of these ideas are rejected, or at least a lot of them at the time, because firearms are getting better. Linear warfare is getting better, and his ideas are regarded as impractical. Now, Frederick the Great, he did read Foulard, and he writes a treatise refuting him, and he describes his ideas as diamonds buried in a dung heap. So a couple good things, but not a lot.
Right.
So he sparked some debate, but at the time, his ideas are just kind of disregarded.
Okay.
So moving forward in time to Maurice de Saxe. And so this guy is actually native German who serves in the French army. And he's influenced by and agreed with Foulard. So we see these theorists start to build off of each other. And so when he fights in the War of Austrian Succession, he actually experiments with columns and their speed and flexibility. Mm-hmm. And his main contribution is my musings, my reveries, and it's published after he died. But once again, he argues for the deep order, so these big shot columns and their speed and flexibility. But he also advocates for dividing units into smaller subunits, which makes them more maneuverable. So he's just another building block. Moving to this next gentleman, and I apologize for this picture here. It's the best one I could find that had free use. So he's Follard's disciple. Once again, advocates the deep order. Once again, brings up the idea that the shock of cold steel is superior to firepower.
This is
And
Francois Jean de Mesnil-Durand.
correct.
Okay.
I apologize. Didn't say his name. I was too focused on that amazing picture. And so he, once again, there's a pattern here. He advocates for these massive shock columns. But what he really does in the orders of French tactics is he says that all three branches of the army, so infantry, cavalry, of artillery, should be combined and integrated into a single unit for greater speed, mobility, and really flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
And this is huge. It lays the basis for combined arms. But this was kind of a sideshow to him saying, hey, we need to bring back the column, revive the shock of cold steel. And his thoughts on combined arms, they do receive some attention. The problem is the 7 Years' War is about to break out, and it's kind of put on the shelf. And so now moving on to the Duke of Broglie. Now we are post-war, and he had served under Marshal Saxe in the War of Austrian Succession, and he's one of the few, if not arguably the only, French generals who achieved success in the 7 Years' War.
Mm-hmm.
He won the rank of Marshal in France. He later serves as a Minister of War. So he actually has quite a bit of clout, a lot of backing to what he's saying. And he made huge contributions to the evolution of French tactics in the 1770s, which later on does have an impact on Napoleon. And he, kind of like some previous gentlemen, he emphasized the army should be divided into small units, and he called them mini armies. Today, we would call them as divisions. And he said these divisions should be divided for speed. He also recognized that greater planning has to go into what you're going to do with these mini armies. They aren't just a giant mass of men you can point towards the enemy. A lot more has to do with planning for logistics, routes, etc.
On your last point, these mini armies, divisions, this is kind of the genesis of Napoleon's core system that he's got to kind of implement.
So we're building up to there.
Right?
Okay. All of these are building up on each other. So they aren't even called divisions yet. Eventually we get to divisions, but because all of these theorists, they're reading each other, they're debating with each other if they're alive at the time. But all of this is kind of in the French military thought.
Okay.
And so they're all a bunch of building blocks, and they're taking some ideas from others and they disregard. But in this case, these mini armies, which become divisions, this is definitely one of those huge things that becomes a hallmark of Napoleonic warfare. And he said these mini armies should all march towards the same objective, but on different roads, so the entire force can arrive to the battlefield more quickly. And then once they get to the battlefield, they have to be able to deploy without confusion. And this is huge. This lays the basis for the operational level of war. Just because rather than, once again, having a giant massed army all marching together, you have your subunits, your mini armies, or eventually it becomes divisions and corps, march separately and then adjust to the enemy. And we'll talk about that later with the battalion carré. But once again, this gentleman is putting another building block in Napoleon's foundation.
Right.
And so Broglie, he pioneered these ideas during the 7 Years' War. And during the 1770s, he experimented with a lot of his ideas during war games. He experiments with column versus line, and a bunch of other of his ideas. And based on his wargaming and also peacetime maneuvers, he found that deep order, so those big shock columns we were talking about, work best when going up against the line, but also as long as they are supported by artillery and a large number of skirmishers. And he doesn't say the deep order is best, just that it could work under specific circumstances. Fortunately for this gentleman, he just could not overcome the cult of firepower that reigned in the French Royal Army. Because no matter the argument, whether him or others, they just all point and look and say, hey, just look at the Prussians. This is what they're doing. Cult of firepower, linear formations, they're the best. So unfortunately, doesn't make a lot of headway. The man who does make a lot of headway is this gentleman, Guibert. I want to start this part by saying two things. First, he is the most important French military theorist of the era, bar none. Secondly, I do want to apologize to Dr. Jonathan Abel if I get anything wrong on Guibert, and everybody should go read his book, and you should definitely have him on your podcast to do an episode.
Okay.
So, in 1773, he's a colonel in the French army, and he receives a rare honor. He is invited to Potsdam, Germany, where Prussian kings had their palaces, to go observe Prussian regimental maneuvers. And if you were invited there and you're a foreigner, it's a really big deal. Frederick shows him this great honor, sits down with him, talks to him about military science and art. Why does Frederick do this? Well, in 1772, Guibert had published General Essay of Tactics, and this publication are his reflections on the 7 Years' War and how the French needed to change and be ready for the next war. It is by far the best piece of literature during this time when many other works are being produced on the subject. This is the very best, and it appears in numerous editions and languages. And I'm oversimplifying here, but there's two main ideas. Idea number one, he calls for a war of movement, of rapid movement. And number two, he calls for an army of citizen soldiers, which, spoiler alert, is what happens once the French Revolution kicks off.
Mm-hmm.
And going into some more detail in his work, he says that the national character of the French soldier is predisposes him to more active attack rather than passive defense. He's more conservative in technical issues, meaning he doesn't outright advocate for the deep order. In fact, he rejected the whole concept of shock and said the laws of physics don't apply. But he did see the utility of small columns used in the attack, but mixed with the line for effective firepower. And so kind of this in-between stance, his ideas goes into development of the mixed order, which we'll talk about later. And the mixed order is essentially you're combining line with column. And by using both, you avoid the inherent weaknesses of both. Guibert also calls for combined arms divisions that could rapidly deploy independent of each other because each division has all three branches. And the great advantage of combined arms warfare is that units could be powerful enough with all three branches that they could hold their ground until friendly units arrive. And as we'll talk about later, combined arms is really best viewed through rock, paper, scissors. Now, you recognize all of this requires a lot more planning. So once again, this is another building block in that operational level of war. So all units are acting in concert. And Guibert calls this grand tactics. The basis of that is divisions should advance the battlefield on different routes within supporting distance. So then they should deploy on the battlefield in unison. So divide, converge, unite. And I know with a lot of these theorists, I'm seem like I'm repeating myself, and I am, because they're all building off of each other. So that's important.
Right.
He also talks about getting rid of the Army's giant baggage train and the Army's dependence on it. Soldiers should only carry what they need for a couple of days and otherwise live off the land. Sounds familiar with Napoleon. Mm-hmm. He also emphasized allowing soldiers to get target practice, which is interesting because it's very expensive to do. In most units, they dry fired, and actual live fire practice was very rare at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's expensive.
All of these, it's expensive. Later on, don't want to get into the science of it, the French figure out ways to make gunpowder cheaper and process it, which helps artillery across the board. But when Guibert is writing, all this is very expensive to do, live fire drills.
Right.
So all of these ideas from Guibert, all these amazing ideas, a lot of them go into the 1788 Reglement, which is like the regulations, the doctrine, the tactics for the French army. Unfortunately for Guibert, there was a huge backlash to a lot of these radical ideas. And in 1790, when he died, largely out of favor with the king and unpopular with his own officer corps, it kind of goes by the wayside. And so there's an updated 1791 Reglement, which reinstated a lot of the traditional close order linear tactics and removed a lot more of his more complicated ideas, but some of his ideas still remain. But most importantly for our discussion is this is something, his works and his ideas is something that Napoleon consumes voraciously, and he also does set up the French army to be better than it was. So
Right.
if you're going to want to know one theorist, this guy's the one to know.
Okay.
Okay. So, last theorist with Bourset. I know I just said no theorist had much of an impact on Guibert, but the one book that had the biggest impact on Napoleon was Bourset's work, The Principles of Mountain Warfare. And Bourset, he was a mountain warfare specialist, and there's three main points in his work. Number one, calls for the army to be divided into small units of 5,000 men, so division, which is going to make it easier for them to move along mountain passes. And this should only be done if the units can move within supporting distance. Kind of under this subpoint, he calls for a central reserve for the army itself. And Napoleon doesn't really pick on a central reserve until 1805, but he does read about it in this. Bourset says small units should fan out and give the appearance of attacking from multiple directions. And by spreading out, it forces the enemy to either make a decision or be unsure where the point of attack truly is.
Right.
He also says small units should all converge, unite, and attack at once on the decisive point. So mass-friendly forces. And he also talks about using speed and deception.
I like your point on supporting distance of each other. And then Napoleon said,
Yes, so that's huge.
Yeah.
And he gets that from Bourset.
Okay.
And this is, once again, something Napoleon voraciously reads. And so Napoleon does a lot of great things, but he is pulling from all of these works.
Mm-hmm.
The second main point is to identify a secondary objective, attack it using a smaller force, and this is done while the main force is attacking the enemy at the decisive point. So today, in modern military parlance, we would say use that as economy of force. You're only using as big as force as necessary to go after that secondary objective, while you're massing most of your combat power against your primary objective. And so what this does, it freezes the enemy. Enemy will remain unsure of their true intentions, and they're likely to fall for that secondary objective or the feints. And so this keeps the enemy dispersed, confused, and weak across the front. His last main point is he advocates for a war of maneuver. And so he calls for large sweeping movements by the army, mainly in the form of envelopments, that 30 to 50 miles a day should be covered. And the purpose of war is to outflank the enemy, cut his communications, and force him into a battle of annihilation or decisive battle. And this is very different from the war position of the 18th century. Instead, it's more of a chess match, trying to obtain a better position than the enemy, trying to cut off their lines of communication, of supply, their home base, kind of putting the enemy in checkmate.
Okay.
So those are the theorists.
All very good. Yeah, I knew about Sachs and Guibert, but the other ones I was not familiar with. So thank you for that.
Yeah, so they're all important. They build off of each other, and there's even more. There's a huge swath of literature and theorists coming out during this time, but I think those are probably the more important one. Now, I think it's important to note that the conditions Napoleon inherited go beyond just military theory, army organization. He's also kind of inheriting a society that was revolutionary in itself, and I think there's much to be said about how the French Revolution impacted military affairs. But the biggest thing, at least in my opinion, is that the French Revolution and the levée en masse, by extension, it made manpower cheap. Armies are no longer expensive. Now soldiers can actually be used and you don't have to worry about replacing them. Because one main thing in the 18th century is during that time of limited war, you were trying to win by, taking a fortress, taking a city. And ideally, you don't want to fight because those armies are expensive. But
Right.
The French Revolution makes manpower cheap. Now, to finally answer the big question of evolutionary versus revolutionary, with all the buildup, you probably think I'm going to say evolutionary, but I'm a firm believer that Napoleon is revolutionary.
Okay.
And I have a few points for that. And because France is fighting for a while before Napoleon kind of puts himself in a position to command armies. And even then, First Italian campaign, he's commanding, at least initially, in a secondary theater. So there's a lot of other French generals that have access to the same stuff he does, even better soldiers, better equipment, more well supplied. And it's not like France didn't have other generals, as we talked about last time. Guibert, pretty solid general, but none of them do what Napoleon does.
Right.
And yes, Napoleon, he builds upon previous work, but any revolution in military affairs, at least in my opinion, it's built upon previous advancements. So he brings all of what I just discussed together and he improves upon it. He was the one genius that could bring it all together. Not only that, right? If you're not going to say Napoleon isn't revolutionary, then who is? The man won Austerlitz, Wagram, Friedland, Ulm. The list goes on.
Right.
I also think the concept of decisive battle or the strategy of annihilation is so unique to him that he has to be revolutionary. Because generally we say there's three strategies. There's attrition, exhaustion, annihilation. Annihilation being decisive battle, which is the hallmark of Napoleon. Not only that, he is studied to this day, and there's a lot of great military commanders throughout history, but not many of them have podcasts about them.
That's an excellent point. And I think kind of what you said, though, like, yeah, these theories existed before, but no one really pulled them all together and implemented them. I think you could say the same thing about the Napoleonic Code. Like those ideas, equal rights in front of courts of law and making everything standardized in law the idea was there, but no one had implemented it until Napoleon came around.
Yeah, and Napoleon, when he's studying at the military academy and really throughout his life, he's constantly reading, he's constantly studying both theorists and previous military commanders. And so I think just his drive to bring in all that information and to actually turn it into something, that's what leads to a lot of this. I just think he's a unique genius that is able to pull everything together and to not only implement these ideas, but actually improve upon them.
Okay. Let's now discuss one of Napoleon's favorite maneuvers, and that's the strategy of central position. So, how can Napoleon defeat an army of 60,000, an enemy army of 60,000, if he only has 50,000 troops?
Yeah, absolutely. He does this time and time again. So the kind of basic definition of central position is when a commander positions his forces at a central point between multiple enemy armies or columns and kind of allows the rapid movement to concentrate against one enemy force at a time. And so in this case, we see here, there's an army of 30,000, and then there's another army of 30,000, and Napoleon in the middle only has 50. So what he can do is he can send, let's see if we can read this, about 10,000 here to block this larger force. And when they're fighting from a defensive position, he doesn't need to destroy them. That's not the objective. He just needs to prevent them from intervening. And then he can take his other 40,000 and go against this other army. So he's actually outnumbering the army at the decisive point against that primary objective of 30,000, while that other secondary army, they're just trying to hold them off. They'll come back and Napoleon will deal with them later.
Right.
And what also central position does, what Napoleon does, and we has these enemy armies that are separated, he doesn't want the enemy armies to join, because if there's two armies of 30,000 to come together, now he's outnumbered.
Right.
But instead, he can defeat them in detail one by one.
So that's kind of what happened at Waterloo, right? They joined up before he could defeat them in detail.
Yeah, so unfortunately for Napoleon, the Prussians show up just in time, and he wanted to defeat Wellington before they showed up, but he wasn't able to do that.
Okay. Well, moving on, I know you're going to show us some examples of his first Italian campaign, correct?
Yep. So when it comes to central position, what you're really doing in a lot of ways is using interior lines to quickly move your forces within your little bubble. And there's multiple times throughout the first Italian campaign where Napoleon uses interior lines in central position, but I think the Rivoli campaign is a good example just because he does make some mistakes. He doesn't really know where the enemy's coming from. But because of his pre-positioning of his forces, he's able to pull out the win. So we'll set the stage for you. It's January 1797, and the Austrians are launching a winter offensive to get Napoleon out of northern Italy. and save poor Wurmser, who's stuck in Mantua.
Right.
Now, of course, they have tried this a few times and didn't work those other times, but it's going to be different this time, except not really. And Napoleon, he's facing a daunting challenge. He has around 35,000 troops, depending on your sources, but he's definitely outnumbered by the combined Austrians. And the Austrians, they're going to attack along three main avenues of approach. And so let me highlight this in
So they're splitting
blue.
their army into divisions or corps, I would say.
More or less, they're
Yeah.
different mini armies, you could say. But there's three
Right.
avenues of approach. So this first one, we're going in blue here. That's Elvinci, and he's the main force advancing down the Adige Valley, and he has about 28,000 men.
Okay.
And then there's another force going down this eastern path of about 6,000 men. And then finally, there's some forces in Padua, and they're advancing with about 9,000 men. And so what you'll see here is you would think, oh, we were just talking about, splitting up your forces, advancing on multiple avenues of approach. The Austrians are doing the same thing that Napoleon's doing and all the theorists said. Not so much, because you have all these mountains in the way. These columns are not advancing within mutually supporting distance.
Yeah, I was going to point that out.
They can't help each other out.
Correct.
With the Austrian army separated, they can't mutually support each other. And here's where interior lines come into play. Napoleon concentrated his forces in essential positions, and this allowed him to rapidly shift troops to meet threats as they materializes. So they're organized into smaller, self-sustaining divisions that can move independently, yet come together for mutual support, which, going back, is a concept inspired by Bourset, Guibert, etc. And so Elvinci's main column arrives here at Rivoli on January 12th. And so now Napoleon realizes, oh, this is now the decisive point of the campaign. This is where the main enemy force is. So as in the following day, on the night of the 13th, he begins concentrating his combat power at Rivoli. And so we have, let me get my pen back out. So we have Massena, who's down here, and we have Ray, who's down here.
Right.
And so troops under Massena and Ray and Victor, they're all rapidly redeployed to Rivoli here in order to reinforce Guibert. And despite being exhausted from marching, they arrived just in time to stabilize the French line and launch decisive counterattacks. And so I won't get into all the tactical movements at Rivoli, but by concentrating his forces precisely where they were needed to most, using interior lines, Napoleon's able to turn a defensive situation that could have gone very poorly into a resounding victory.
And we were talking about mutual support. Napoleon's troops could support him at the main point of contact. The Austrians could not.
Correct.
Yeah.
And let's say, for example, for whatever reason, the main point of attack was here at Verona, he still could have moved Massena and Ray and Guibert to support them. So no matter where the Austrians show up, he's able to adjust his forces.
Got it.
Versus, if Elvinci is like, oh, they're out of Rivoli, he can't go and send, I guess he could send a message to Prevera, but he's so far out in the woods that he can't support him.
And thus, Rivoli is one of Napoleon's best victories.
In some ways, yes. I mean, he does make some mistakes. He's a little spread out at the start. He doesn't know exactly, like Elvinci kind of surprises him. I think he actually does better in some previous to the Italian engagements. But I think Rivoli's a great example, just because the way he positions his troops, he provides himself an opportunity to make up for his mistakes and pull out success. Okay. And even after Rivoli, his operational flexibility doesn't start there, because he still has these Austrian forces down here in the south. And so he immediately marches his forces south to counter Prevera's column. And, despite having just fought a battle and marched another 24 hours, they intercept and defeat Prevera at La Favorita. And that's kind of the final surrender of the 7,000 Austrians. And this shatters the Austrian offensive. So kind of the main point of this, by occupying this central position, he's able to defeat the Austrians in detail rather than having to engage the entire enemy force at once. And he's also able to quickly redeploy his forces to where the battle is. Because sometimes Napoleon knows exactly where the enemy is. Like at Austerlitz, he knows where they are. He's going to pull all the strings. In this case, he knows the Austrians will be coming. He doesn't necessarily know when or where the main avenue of approach is.
Okay.
Because in a previous campaign, a few months prior, the Austrians come a different route. They take this as their primary route. And so he doesn't necessarily know if they're going to try that again or they're going to do something different.
Okay.
Being in central position isn't always an automatic win. Moving forward in time to Leipzig. So looking at the map, we see Napoleon is, yes, he is occupying a central position in a sense. But interior lines, they work best when a commander can operate from a central position. But at Leipzig, he's entirely surrounded by multiple coalition armies, kind of leaving him with limited flexibility to maneuver. Now, he is trying to pull them into Leipzig, but by doing so, his position becomes a liability rather than advantage. And when we were just talking about the Austrians, they obviously made a lot of mistakes. By the time we get to Leipzig, 1813, we're in the Sixth Coalition, so there's been a few coalition wars, and the Allies are actually starting to learn. And the three main coalition armies, they coordinate their movements, they have mutual support, and they prevent Napoleon from isolating and defeating them piecemeal like he had done in Rivoli. And so it kind of makes it impossible for Napoleon to exploit weaknesses in the lines. And there's also something to be said for the sheer size of the forces. Allied forces have around 300,000, Napoleon around 200,000. And that meant that even local concentration against one enemy army couldn't necessarily guarantee success. Not only that, by the time we get to Sixth Coalition, Napoleon's army, a lot of conscripts, not well trained, they're just tired.
Yeah.
And not only that, if you look at the terrain here, there's no mountains to exploit.
Right.
It's all very open. So unlike at Rivoli, where the narrow valley terrain neutralized the Austrians' numerical superiority, the open terrain doesn't allow him to do that.
And I think if you go to your next slide, you can see that Napoleon was kind of surrounded on all sides.
So this is what I was getting to. So actually, his main thing, he wanted to destroy Schwarzenberg's army. In detail. He was going to mass against them. But because the other Allied armies, they keep pressing him and they gain contact, by the time we actually get to the battle, it's in a relatively small maneuver space, and he's surrounded and he's fighting all sides. So rather than just defeat Schwarzenberg in detail, he has to fight everywhere at once. And so now this central position doesn't work out. Because when we're talking about central position and interior lines, we're talking kind of on the operational level, like how we're moving the units to the battle. By the time we actually get to Leipzig, it's pure tactical because everything's within the sound of the guns, and he doesn't have that operational flexibility to maneuver.
Yeah.
So interior lines, they can be a powerful tool, but their success depends on the enemy's disposition and your own ability to exploit gaps and weaknesses.
Yeah, looking at this map, you can see, he has ease of movement. So let's say Marmont has to fall back, he can rush troops over there. But there's also basically one road in, one road out. So he's low on ammunition, low on reinforcements. So as we all know, he has to take one road out, and that the surrounding Allied armies just kind of collapse upon him.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the Trachtenberg plan later. But by the time we get to Leipzig, Napoleon's army, it's exhausted, and this is, in a lot of ways, it's a battle of desperation.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Let's move now. What are some hallmarks of a Napoleon-led operation?
Absolutely. Number one, concentrate all available forces for the decisive attack. What that means is you're not trying to break apart your combat force. You're not putting them on cordon duty. One big thing in the 18th century, you would have like cordon armies or picket armies. And so you might have 50,000, but you're breaking them up into a whole bunch of armies or units of observation. Those units spread out across, half the country, it's not going to help you when battle is actually started. And so he also, at least for most of his career, he's not expending resources or troops on not things that aren't essential, such as geographic objectives or assets. And he's trying to, what we say, mass his forces, concentrate his forces. And so that way, at the main point of attack, he has numerically superior forces. Even though, like we're talking about at Rivoli, yes, his enemy might outnumber him within the area of operations or the theater, but for the actual point of attack, he has more forces.
Okay.
Number two, you want your main force, or Napoleon wants his main force directed against the enemy's center of power. And that is essentially most times is the main enemy army. And so as you're advancing towards the main enemy army to gain that decisive battle, you want to make sure that your attack, your army is masked by a cavalry screen. Because at the time, cavalry before battle served kind of two main purposes. One is scouting, so gaining information and intelligence on the enemy, but also screening your own forces, so protecting your own forces from observation. And if possible, while advancing against the main enemy force, if you can outflank your opponent and you cut off his lines of communication and supply, that's ideal, because you're putting the enemy in a bad situation to where they have to retreat, come against you and attack you in a defensive position to regain that. Or, with the Ulm campaign, you just surrender your entire army.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. No, these are good. I was thinking of the Ulm campaign with the cavalry screen of Murat, and then Napoleon kind of fell on his rear. Yeah, very good. Okay, number three.
So on the day of actual battle, you want to concentrate your attack on a key sector of the enemy's position. So you're not necessarily spreading all of your combat power across the entire enemy force. Napoleon's going to identify a key sector to concentrate the combat power. I think a good example at Austerlitz, obviously, at least initially, Pratzen Heights, right? That's kind of the key focus. And once you have that, everything falls into place. But you're going to prepare your assault with a massive artillery bombardment. Napoleon is obviously famous for his grand batteries. And then that's going to be followed with infantry and deep shot columns. And the central reserve, which oftentimes Imperial Guard, that's be committed at the right moment to deliver that crushing blow, the coup de grace.
Right.
And Napoleon was great about that, because when you're talking about the battlefields of early 19th century, they don't have radios and things take a long time to develop. So Napoleon would often identify this well in advance. It's like, oh, this part of the line will be breaking in 30 minutes. At the same time, that's why he was often positioned right on top of his reserve or the guard, so he could directly give orders to them.
Got it.
And then number four, and this in my opinion is the most important, is immediate ruthless pursuit of the enemy after victory to render the enemy army incapable of further operations. You look at any of his major victories, with the exception of Austerlitz, because that's so crushing. But like Jena and Auerstadt, for example. Yes, the Prussians are crushed, but he seals that victory with Murat's relentless cavalry pursuit. And that's what seals the deal. And in many ways, once we get to the Sixth Coalition, when he doesn't have any cavalry left after trying to deal with the Russians, is he wins quite a few battles, but he's never able to actually pursue the enemy and put a nail in the coffin. And of course, after the war, you have Germany writing all of his things. One thing Germany emphasizes is pursuit. Mm-hmm. And so that's what allows you to turn a tactical victory into an actual decisive battle and strategic success.
Very good. Very good. Okay, well, those are four pretty important things. Thanks for going over those with us.
Yeah, of course.
Now, speaking of very important things, we're going to talk about the three arms of the militaries in the late 1700s, early 1800s. We have the infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Why do military historians refer to them as rock, paper, scissors?
The backbone of any army, the most numerically present thing in any army, is infantry. and you could just line them up and shoot at each other, like you kind of see in that left picture of Prussians. But that's a bit too close to a fair fight, and we don't want that. At least military commanders don't want that. So
Right.
what you think you could do is you charge the enemy with cavalry. And personally, I don't want to see a formation of war horses charging me at full gallop. And these cavalry charges, they could be really devastating, and they could break the line, and they could break an army. So going back to the rock, paper, scissors, is normally infantry is the paper and cavalry are the scissors, but infantry could form a square and become the rock. And so typically the square formation is battalion size, but larger units could form squares if necessary. And it creates hollow squares with soldiers forming the perimeter, and you have reserves and your officers on the inside. You can also put your baggage train. In this picture of the Battle of the Pyramids, you can see Napoleon's cavalry and a lot of the baggage train officers are inside these giant squares. And these formations are very effective against cavalry.
Mm-hmm.
And some historical background. Throughout history, the best defense against cavalry was a dense formation filled with a whole bunch of pikes and long spears. Forms a giant pokey barrier. But the bayonet, specifically the socket bayonet, it revolutionizes defense. So now infantry has a weapon, the musket, that's effective for both melee defense and also firepower.
Right.
And it kind of combines the anti-cavalry function of the pike with the musket's firepower and versatility. And generally, squares prevented cavalry from breaking through because of all the bayonets and very disciplined fire by ranks. But in order for your square to be effective, you did have to have that disciplined musket fire, and you had to make sure you fired when they were close. Oftentimes, cavalry would wheel in and out trying to get them to fire too early.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some limitations to the square. So it requires coordination to transition quickly between the line and square formations. If you're not well trained, it could take too long, and by the time the cavalry gets there, you're not formed into the square. It also depends on a lot of discipline from the troops to maintain the formation under pressure from the cavalry assaults, and also limits your firepower to the front. You only have 25% of your firepower to either side, or really to the side facing the main enemy force.
Right.
And of course, the square is static. You're not really moving anywhere very quickly.
Right.
And so this painting I have here, this is the Battle of the Pyramids. And so typically you have a battalion form a square, think 500, 2,000 men. Here, Napoleon forms divisional size squares. So these absolutely giant squares, oftentimes, as you can see here, the square could be kind of supported by artillery on the corners. And as the cavalry got close, they could go and run back inside the square. But obviously, at this battle, the squares are absolutely devastating, and they work great against cavalry. The problem is with squares, once again going back to rock, paper, scissors, is infantry packed tightly into a square are easy targets for artillery, particularly canister shot at close range. This is Civil War era canister shot, but same exact concept. And what canister shot does is it's a cannon-sized shotgun. And so the ranges varied, but at a 12-pounder Napoleon, you're looking at like 600 meters mass effective range, but ideally closer.
Right.
So ideally, if you're a Napoleon or any commander and you're attacking the enemy, you could press an infantry formation with cavalry. So the infantry, your enemy infantry, they form the square. But then once they form the square, you can catch them in the square with artillery.
Right.
Or even if you have that cavalry which is backed by infantry coming up, if you just have your own infantry in a line, you can catch the square because only 25% firepower to the front. And of course, you could also use artillery with solid shot at longer ranges against infantry formations for counter battery fire. And we didn't go into the nitpickiness or the play-by-play of Napoleon at the tactical level, but that's what often he would do, right? It wouldn't just be a cavalry charge. It would be coordinated with follow-on infantry attacks or follow-on artillery bombardment with his horse artillery. So that way they're caught out of position and then they get eviscerated.
And that's what they mean by a combined arms attack. Like, send the cavalry, force them to get into a square, and then I'm going to bring up artillery to follow that up.
Absolutely. And so, each kind of arm of the army at the time, they all have their strengths and weaknesses, and then you're going to play those off of each other. And combined arms, it doesn't just mean, oh, we have a division or a unit with artillery, cavalry, infantry. What it means is we're coordinating those three branches together in our attack.
Yeah.
And so they're not operating independently, they're operating in concert.
Yeah. And horses aren't stupid animals. If there's a wall of humans with bayonets bristling at every edge, they're not going to charge into that.
Generally, no. There are accounts of squares being broken.
Sure, rarely.
But
yeah.
but certainly it's not ideal.
Yeah.
But if you had a disciplined infantry formation, very unlikely the squares were going to break. I mean, the French they tried their best at Waterloo, but the British didn't break.
Well, yeah, I've read a few accounts where, and it's so rare that when a square breaks, it's a big headline. Like Garcia Hernandez, I think General Foy's divisions formed square, and I think one of the infantrymen fired too late, and the horse kind of was killed, but it plowed into the line and made a hole in a square, and that's how the British were able to get into that square. So they are breakable on occasion, but it's very, very rare.
No, so it's possible. It's not impossible, some people say, but I wouldn't want to charge into that personally.
Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the infantry side of formations. I know you brought it up earlier. We're talking line versus column. Can you kind of walk us through that and what battalion carré is?
So we'll start off with the line, and I'm going to talk each formation off this same slide for comparison's sake. So right now I have the line highlighted with this yellow oval here. And what this allows you to do, it's maximum firepower to the front. It's hard to maneuver. Once in place, you can kind of wheel it back and forth, but you're not getting anywhere quickly. Typically 3 ranks deep. The British, they like 2 ranks, but typically 3 ranks deep. Each rank can fire, and it allows you to get maximum firepower to the front. You can just throw as much lead downrange as fast as you can reload. So that's kind of the basic line formation. Okay. Now we have these columns highlighted. And so the column, they're easier to maneuver, and they can allow you to punch through the enemy with that shock of cold steel Foulard was talking about. But you sacrifice firepower to the front, and at best, only the first few ranks can fire. The guy 10 rows back, he can't fire. I guess he could try, but he's just going to hit his buddy. But you have the mass needed to break through the enemy lines, because if you're charging an enemy line with one of these columns, yes, the first few ranks might get cut down, but then there's just more people behind them to punch through. But now, best of all, we have the mixed order that Guibert wanted. And it gives you the firepower of the line with the maneuver and punching power of the column. And this is one of the formations Napoleon is famous for. And so to try to explain this to people that are listening, you have your typical line formation, but interspersed in the line, you have these attack columns. And so as they advance, not only do you have that, but you also have skirmishers to the front, which are going to go forward, and they're going to harass the enemy. They're going to try to break up those lines, which are followed by your own line formations with firepower. So by the time these shot columns are hitting the enemy line is broken up, they're disoriented, and they just don't have the depth to withstand an attack.
Okay.
Make sense?
Got it. Very interesting.
All right. Moving on to the battalion carré. Okay. Now this was how Napoleon moved, and it was his way of marching separately but fighting together, which should sound familiar from earlier in the theorists. And the advantage is speed, but also flexibility in flanking the enemy. And so we have corps kind of set up in a diamond here. And each corps in our diamond formation could fight and survive while the others maneuvered to support or flank. And in some cases went on their own, which wasn't the design, but it shows you how good Napoleon's corps and marshals were. And so this lead northernmost corps, that'd be the advance guard. And then you have corps on either other side of the diamond as the flank. And between each corps, you're going to have 1 day's march. They have a decent amount of distance between them, but it's going to allow them to relatively quickly come to the battle. Let's say the enemy, like we're marching north. Here's the presumed enemy position, but we get intelligence that the enemy position is actually to our west.
Right.
So if the enemy shows up on the flank, the corps can now very quickly reorient. An existing example with the enemy on our left. So the corps that was our left flank is now our new advance guard. Our old advance guard, now the right flank. This corps to the south is the new left flank, and this one in the east, that's our new reserve. And so no matter where the enemy comes from, we're good. And even from this new reserve to the advance guard, that's about 2 to 3 days march. And ideally, Napoleon is always in the center. That way he can march where he needs to, coordinate what he needs to. And of course, in addition to the battalion cavalry, what Napoleon told all of his marshals, in the absence of orders, you march to the sound of the guns. So with any of these corps, they come into contact, they don't have standing orders from Napoleon, they march to the sound of the guns. And so these corps can either go reinforce that battle, or depending on what direction they're coming from, by their very nature of their initial positioning and movement, they're now flanking the enemy.
Mm-hmm. And that provides a lot of flexibility when you're marching. Like, all right, yes, it'd be nice to know where the enemy is, but if we're not sure, kind of like at Jena and Auerstadt, we'll just put it in this position to march.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about Jena and Auerstadt later, but it gives you flexibility, and it's absolutely great. And just one more building block that we were talking about earlier with the theorists that Napoleon really fully masters and implements to great success.
Okay. Very good. All right. Well, what about on the artillery side? Were there any innovations there?
Absolutely. The French, by the time Napoleon comes along, the French, they have the best artillery system in Europe, thanks to the Guibert system. Before the Guibert system, cannons, when they were cast along kind of a mold that had a hollow core. And the problem is this led to a lot of variation in the bore sizes, which led to decreased accuracy. A guy by the name of John Moritz, he comes up with a method to where you cast the cannon solid out of one giant chunk of metal, and then you mill out the bore. And so this leads to more precise and better tolerances. And so the actual method of production becomes better. But Gribeval, he does a lot of other things. He standardizes calibers, and as you can see on the slide, but there's also other improvements. The rounds now come pre-packaged, and it's a much faster rate of fire than the old system. And so before Gribeval's system, there was a Valery system, and you could get off a shot once every 2 minutes or so. Now with this new system, you can get 1 or 2 shots a minute, depending on the system. So 2 to 3 times as fast. He also standardizes parts across the board. This means faster and cheaper production. He makes the carriage wheels bigger. And so the carriages and the caissons, the things that are carrying all the ammunition, could move faster, but really more importantly, they get stuck less.
Right.
Each gun itself, it has a calibrated rear sight and elevation screw. So you can really dial in your shots now. Mm-hmm. And the system's adopted in 1764, but the tactics remain the same really until the 1780s, which brings me to the Dutai brothers. Both French artillery officers. Jean-Pierre Dutai, he ran the best artillery school in Europe, and his younger brother on the left wrote the use of the new artillery. And to summarize their findings and arguments, they advocated for lighter, more mobile guns, and to mass the guns in larger batteries, a grand battery, if you will. And traditionally, cannons, they were spread out across the battlefield, but the Dutai brothers said, no, you keep the guns together and use them as anti-personnel weapons rather than to counter enemy artillery fire. Instead, they argued for horse artillery should be used for counter battery fire. And of course, it's also good to note that Napoleon studied under Jean-Pierre Dutai, and he also participated in many of their experiments. So to go back to the original question, way back about revolutionary versus evolutionary, the Guibert system and these two gentlemen are certainly building blocks of Napoleon's greatness.
Yeah, and I think that's an important innovation, or I guess improvement. Instead of hauling all these different cannons with all these different cannonball sizes and different carriage sizes like the enemy armies were, Napoleon, by limiting to, I think you had 3 or 4 cannon sizes and you had 1 howitzer size, it just made it easier to move your armies faster and more efficiently across Europe.
He does, and as Napoleon progresses in his career, he takes out one of them. He makes it even more simple. He increases the number of guns in units. He wants more and more artillery, which makes sense given him being an artillery officer. But the French have by far and away the best artillery system in Europe. The only one that matches them are the Spanish, sort of, but that's just because they copy the Guibert system and nobody else comes close.
Got it.
And not to go on too much of a tangent, but like, for example, Arthur Wellesley, one of the issues he has campaigning in Spain, especially with the siege artillery, is he has a lot of it's old and there's different calibers and he just can't keep it supplied.
Right.
So the French artillery quality, but also how they use it, definitely gives Napoleon an advantage.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the core system. I know Napoleon didn't create it, but it sounds like he perfected it, correct?
Yeah, so a lot of those interwar writers I told you about earlier, they kind of form the basis for what the core system becomes under Napoleon. And in 1805, when the War of the Third Coalition begins, he changes the name of the army in England, which was training on the coast, to the Grande Armée. And it was the final level of the new French organization, and he also divided it into 7 army corps. And now this army had more flexibility and more mobility than any other army in Europe because of this system. And each army corps typically had 2 to 4 infantry divisions. Each division had an artillery battery. Each corps also has a cavalry division or a cavalry brigade, and also horse artillery battery. And I think more importantly, each corps has a commander, it has general staff, and it has support personnel like engineers and quartermasters. And these corps, could then be combined into armies between 50,000 and 500,000 men. And so this is the concept of the mini army. It's now fully achieved. It has reached its peak. And the army corps, or the corps system, allows Napoleon to hit his enemies hard and rapidly. Each corps has all 3 branches. It has its own reserves. And each corps was designed to be able to hold its ground for 24 hours against a conventional neighboring army, buying time for the supporting corps to arrive. Now, in some cases, like in Arstadt, a French army corps managed to not only hold, but win against the enemy. And leading up to the engagement, Napoleon is advancing in his traditional battalion carré with 180,000 troops across the multiple columns, which is maintaining the flexibility to converge. And the battalion carré creates a lot of uncertainty for the Prussians, who disperses their forces to guard multiple avenues of approach. So if you look in the map, we have Brunswick up here. His units are dispersed all over the place. Versus Napoleon, we're all kind of advancing in this direction. We have Davout and Third Corps up here. Bernadotte is doing his usual stuff, but all of Napoleon's corps are spread out. And so by the time we get to the actual battle, well, really, upon Napoleon locating the Prussians, Napoleon can pivot all his formations very quickly. And he concentrates most of his army against Hohenlohe, who he thought was the main enemy army, but he's able to mass them in a matter of hours. But it's really a dual success, both for the battalion carré, for the corps system, for Napoleon. Because at Jena, where Napoleon masses his force, and he does destroy a significant portion of the Prussian army, which he thinks is the main one. Now, up here at Auerstadt was a simultaneous but completely separate battle. Davout's single corps by itself not only holds off, but it defeats a larger Prussian force, which is really the bulk of the Prussian army. And so not only does the corps system allow Davout to survive, he actually somehow wins. And that's kind of on miscalculation of Napoleon. He thought he's facing the main army. He wasn't, even after learning about Davout's success, he's like, oh, I don't like that. I'm the one who won, but he lets Davout, go into Berlin first.
Right.
Now, of course, had this gentleman, the first corps commander, Bernadotte, had he come to help Davout, the fight would have been easier, but he just kind of sits there, and I don't want to go too much on a rant about his worst marshal. Of course, after the battle, Napoleon makes sure the Prussians are pursued, going back to that fourth operational tenet we were talking about earlier, and he's able to translate that tactical victory into strategic success, and the Prussians are defeated.
Yeah, I remember reading about the pursuit of the three marshals, including Bernadotte, and kind of swept up the remnants of the Prussian army.
Yep, so not only is it a great victory, but he seals that victory with that pursuit.
Yeah. Okay, another interesting concept, and again, I know Napoleon did not originate this one, but it was copied by his enemies, which is the concept of a chief of staff and a headquarters staff. They had these in other armies too, because I know it was very important in the Prussian army and the Austrian army, but let's talk about this.
So the Austrians, they actually had an okay one well before the Napoleonic Wars, but we'll talk through it. So I don't think anyone could really replicate Berthier. I'm actually not the biggest fan of Napoleon's staff, but I'll get into that. Now, his staff, it included a large number of intelligence officers, and their main duty was to feed Napoleon information rather than that formulate plans for the army. That was Napoleon's job. They're fact finders. They're pretty much Napoleon's Google search engine. Hey, what's the tide of this river? Where is this? Just all of that, right? He Googled using his staff officers. His staff numbered about 400 officers, and he had 3 bureaus in the staff. There's a bureau of intelligence, of topography, maps, and then of correspondence. And Napoleon, he gets all this information. He soaks it up like a sponge, and then he's the one to make decisions. He's the one to formulate strategy and provide the operational orders for his corps commanders. If Napoleon was at the battle, he was on the battlefield, he was the one directing everything. And he really did have a charisma that was seldom seen on the battlefields of Europe. But I think his biggest problem was he failed to grasp the importance of a general staff system. His general staff functioned more like a secretariat. And Berthier's role, chief of staff, his genius, his role was to take Napoleon's complicated orders, rewrite and simplify them, and then to hand them out.
Right.
It wasn't really two-way communication. It was more Napoleon's making the decision. He's developing the plans, one-man system. Hey, Berthier, here's what I want you to do. Berthier had the amazing talent of translating it to the corps commanders, to the marshals, making it happen. And the superior model, at least in my opinion, was the Prussian model that they began developing in 1806 after they absolutely get smashed. There were some movement towards this in the previous years, but their defeat really serves as a catalyst. And on the Prussian model, generally speaking, the staff, it's the intellectual nerve center of the army. So the army isn't dependent on one man. And the Prussian model is essentially what the modern model of a staff is on what we operate today, at least in the United States Army. The staff advises the commander up until the point of decision. So they are very much part of the planning process. And while I don't want to say that under the Prussian model, the army commander and the chief of staff were equals, they weren't, but there was a lot more collaboration and crosstalk versus with Napoleon and Berthier, where the conversation is all one way.
Right.
And of course, Gneisenau, chief of staff, he's paired up with Blücher, and he kind of cements the importance of the role of that chief of staff. So in many ways, I don't know if copied is the right word, but Napoleon certainly provided the catalyst needed for reform.
Yeah, it's just an interesting system. Marshal Berthier is there to, like you said, collect all the information, hand it to Napoleon, and then get Napoleon's orders, and then disseminate it to Murat, Ney, Davout, whoever, and make it easily understandable. Like, this is where you need to be at this time, at this point on the map, and go do it. And he had to be very clear with everyone.
Yeah, I think Berthier, depending on who you talk to, I don't think he gets enough credit. And
I agree.
I don't think Napoleon is nearly successful without Berthier. Now, of course, the one time Berthier tried to kind of command on his own in the absence of Napoleon, it doesn't go so well, but everyone's good at certain things.
And the one time Waterloo campaign where he didn't have Berthier, it didn't go well.
Yeah, if only I had him.
Yeah.
But that's another conversation.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, there's an interesting moment in 1813 where Marshal Bernadotte has gone over to the Allies, as has former French General Moreau, and they tell the Allies that even though they have more troops, artillery than Napoleon, that they're unlikely to beat Napoleon. What was the Trachenberg plan?
So let's quickly go through the Allies' record with fighting Napoleon and other coalition. Or the Third Coalition. Home campaign, the Austrian army under Mack, they surrendered after being encircled by Napoleon. And of course, at Austerlitz, the Russo-Austrian army is defeated and one of the greatest victories of all time. But the kind of takeaway here is all the major coalition powers are defeated separately. The Austrian army, about 50,000, doesn't combine with the other forces. Or the Fourth Coalition, you have Jena and Auerstadt, the Prussians are crushed by Napoleon, and the Russians haven't even showed up yet. And of course, they're eventually taken out in Friedland, but once again, you have the two major coalition powers in this war. They're defeated separately. But moving to 1813 and this war, the Sixth Coalition you're asking about, the Allies still suffer a series of defeats and near disasters at the hands of Napoleon and like Lutzen, Bautzen, and this is despite Napoleon's army having been devastated in Russia. I'm of the opinion if Napoleon actually has some cavalry to pursue, he's able to do more with those. So in order to have a chance at winning, the Allies developed the Trachenberg plan, which boils down to don't fight Napoleon alone. So the three Allied armies would form a wide arc that kind of contained the French, and they would only fight detached French corps, not Napoleon. So if there's a corps by itself, yeah, we'll go fight them. Napoleon's there, let's just run away.
Right.
And so if Napoleon tried to concentrate against one Allied army, that army retreats, and the other two would attack Napoleon's flank and line of communications. So just kind of nip at his heels. And the plan is successful. After the summer armistice, the Allies exhaust the French, and they just keep chipping away. In those series of weeks, the French lose about 150,000 men. There's about another 50,000 on the sick list. They lose 300 guns. And so Napoleon is desperate. And so he draws the Allies into Leipzig. And I said earlier, he wants to destroy Schwarzenberg's army to the south of the city. But because the Allies are actually coordinating with each other, they converge on all sides. And so he isn't able to concentrate his forces for the attack. So in conclusion, the Trachenberg plan is not to fight Napoleon alone, and the plan works.
It's a really good idea by the Allies because it does two things, in my opinion. Builds your army's morale because you get quick victories over the marshals, but not Napoleon. So it shows that, hey, we can beat these guys. And secondly, it's wearing out Napoleon, his Imperial Guard, and the main part of the army because they're kind of running to every front trying to catch up, but they're probably wondering, well, why do they keep retreating when we show up? So it's wearing out Napoleon.
Yeah,
as well.
they're tired. I mean, they're tired from last year. The ones who survived Russia. A lot of these are conscripts who don't have that physical endurance, and it makes Napoleon just run back and forth.
Right.
And I also think the fact that they're able to develop this plan. I mean, it's on one hand, it's kind of like it took you how many coalition wars to get there, but it speaks to the challenges of coalition warfare.
Sure.
Because previously, yes, you had the first coalition, the second, third, so on, but each major power, they had their own objectives, what they wanted to get out of this war. Yeah, Napoleon was involved in it, but they wanted the specific territory or they wanted whatever. In this case, the major Allied powers are finally like, okay, Napoleon is the issue. He is the main objective, and this is how we're going to go about it.
Okay. All right. There's another element, and it's kind of pie in the sky, hard to describe, but I'm going to take a crack at it. I've heard people discuss Napoleon's mastery of space and time. He knew where and when he had to move his armies to secure a victory. He also knew what his enemies were going to do, in some cases before they did. Did he have like a sixth sense on the battlefield of how to position his armies to secure a victory?
Yeah, he certainly had coup d'oeil, which is what the term is. It's something that's been written about before Napoleon, after Napoleon, and it literally means stroke of the eye or at a glance. And the way I describe it to my students, it's kind of the ability to kind of take everything in instantly, have an understanding of the battlefield, you know what's going on, and then you make decisions with that understanding. And a lot of people have tried to understand it, but Napoleon certainly had it. There's kind of like the military art, the military science. It goes into the military art. And you also have to keep in mind the battlefield, it's a confusing place. We don't have drones from above looking down. There's smoke. You know, you haven't heard from Murat in the last 30 minutes, but somehow Napoleon is able to take in all this massive amount of information, glance at the battlefield, and he knows what's going on. And there's plenty of examples of Napoleon's coup d'oeil. I think the best example is probably Austerlitz, because he really visualizes the battle days before it happens. He lured his opponents in attacking Pratzen Heights, and he perfectly times his counterattack. And your episode with Dr. Abel on the battle was great.
Thank
So
you.
Napoleon definitely has coup d'oeil, but I think his preparation that he put into his victories is often overlooked. A lot of this work happens before the battle itself. Of course, Austerlitz, days before the battle, like, he uses deception. He makes his army appear weaker than it is. He baits the Allied delegation. He's like, "Oh, I'm so weak. Please don't attack me." He's the puppet master pulling the strings. He also spends the time before the battle himself, but also that staff we were talking about, just gathering a massive amount of information from the locals about the terrain, about the weather, about enemy dispositions, knowing that the fog was going to be there to hide that counterattack. So he definitely has coup d'oeil, but I think it also, a lot of that has to do with the preparations he put before the engagements themselves.
Yeah, and I think there's something to, I think it was Patton's quote, a good plan today, violently executed, is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. You know,
100%.
there's the point where, all right, you have all your maps and you have all your information, but you just got to go in and hope for the best. And
You do.
yeah,
And so, I mean, I always told my lieutenants, and I tell my cadets, okay or a bad plan now is better than a perfect plan too late. And there's no plan is ever going to be perfect. No plan's ever going to survive first contact with the enemy, but that doesn't mean planning is important. I
right.
think I might get the general wrong, but, and the quote was highly wrong, but I think it's Eisenhower who said, "Planning is nothing, but planning is everything." And it makes sense to me, because you have to put in the prep work, and the more of a plan that you have that you can deviate from, the better, because it's
Yeah.
all that preparation will still come into play, that the analysis, the training, etc. And so there's certainly the initial plan and be able to react. But part of the reason he's able to pull off Austerlitz is because he has good corps commanders. He has a corps system. He's able to count on Davout marching over 80 miles in a matter of days,
Yeah.
and just shows up at the battle, which of course the Allies weren't expecting.
Yeah.
It's a lot of prep work.
Okay. Well, my final question is, what elements of Napoleon's victories and battlefield planning are important for today's armies to learn and master?
Yeah, I'm going to boil it down to two main points. First is preparation, which I was just talking about, because so much of his success in battle came before the battle. Whether it's gathering intelligence, organizing his armies, or really voraciously studying military theory or anything else, he set the conditions for success well before the day of the battle. And so for the officers of today, I know this personally, reading boring doctrine manuals isn't the most fun thing. I don't know if there's a way to make doctrine interesting,
Right.
but that base of knowledge is key. And I think the second point I will have is, don't rest on your laurels.
Hmm.
Past success doesn't guarantee you future success.
Right.
Your enemies are always learning and always adapting. And so we have to as well. We have to continually get better.
Right.
Napoleon, he wins in the first coalition. He wins in the second coalition. He wins in the third coalition. He wins in the fifth coalition. But eventually his enemies start to learn. His enemies get better. And I don't think they ever get as good as him. I mean, he pulls off some crazy victories in the Sixth Coalition and the 100 Days campaign.
Yeah.
But sometimes just being good enough, or in this case, his enemies being good enough, that gets you the win. It's an ongoing process of continual development and getting better. So those are my takeaways from Napoleon, because ultimately I think a lot of Napoleon's success came from his hard work and preparation. But I think I'm of the opinion that he had a genius that you just can't teach, and you can't replicate genius, but there are things you can learn from him.
Yeah, and I think that those are great points. Nobody cares what you did yesterday. Don't rest on your laurels.
Yep.
And preparation, like if you're going into a fight, I think it was the Duke of Wellington, is just you need to be prepared to fight 5 minutes longer than the other guy, and that's how you win. There's so much that current military leaders could learn from Napoleon. It's just hard to encapsulate it.
I mean, it's hard to encapsulate it. I think from talking to my coworkers, my peers, other instructors and professors at West Point, I think a lot of them have different takeaways from Napoleon's or different takeaways from different military commanders. Ultimately, we do still study Napoleon in depth, whether in the Army, at West Point itself, and everyone kind of draws their own lessons learned. But a lot of the concepts, military concepts, still there. If you read Army Doctrine, it talks, or Joint Doctrine talks about mass, concentration, surprise, all of that, all the concepts, all things that Napoleon did. So, from a military aspect, pure doctrinal standpoint, Napoleon still very much has relevance today.
Okay. Well, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you, Major Hamel. That was wonderful stuff. Yeah, no, you were great.
Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, and again, Major Michael Hamel is instructor at West Point, and as always, we are thrilled to have him on the show. And yeah, fabulous stuff. Thank you for that.
No, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.